Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating economic paradox that's essentially hiding in plain sight. We're looking at the latest UK inflation data from May 2026. Now, on the surface, the numbers look totally dormant, flat. But just beneath that flat line, there is this massive, incredibly volatile tug-of-war tearing through the economy. The headline figure makes it look like a calm, steady sea, but the underlying currents are literally pulling in wildly opposite directions. It's a truly unique moment in modern economic history.
Which brings us to the core mystery we need to solve today. How on earth does the headline inflation rate stay perfectly flat when the cost of everyday transport, pumping petrol, booking a flight, is absolutely skyrocketing? It's a paradox, right? And it really highlights that jarring disconnect between official macroeconomic reporting and the reality you and I actually feel in our wallets. I mean, when the evening news says inflation has stabilized, but your weekend road trip costs 20% more, yeah, that creates some serious cognitive dissonance.
Okay, let's set the stage by zooming out to the global level for a second. We're navigating a super unusual macroeconomic environment right now, where massive, historic monetary policies are having, well, strangely muted effects. Take Japan, for instance. They just executed a historic 1% interest rate hike. That is a massive lever to pull, yet the yen remains stubbornly stuck right around 160. So huge, dramatic economic inputs are resulting in these bizarrely flatlined outputs globally. And as we dig into the data, you'll see the UK is experiencing its own fascinating version of this exact phenomenon.
Let's zoom in on Europe to see how this fits into a broader regional trend. The UK is actually moving in near-perfect lockstep with its neighbors, which signals a massive structural plateau across the whole continent. The UK's Consumer Prices Index hit 2.8% in May 2026. And get this, that exactly matches the flash estimate from France, and it's just a single hair above Germany's 2.7%. This uniformity tells us something absolutely crucial. The forces keeping inflation grounded aren't just isolated domestic policies. They are sweeping pan-European economic currents.
Now, when we look at the 10-year trend, the sheer flatness of the recent data is genuinely staggering. The Consumer Prices Index, including owner-occupiers' housing costs, what we call CPIH, is holding incredibly steady at 3.0%. Meanwhile, the standard CPI sits totally frozen at 2.8%. Neither of these metrics budged a single decimal point from April to May, just a total unwavering flatline. In a dynamic, breathing economy, maintaining this kind of perfect equilibrium month over month is exceptionally rare, which, only deepens the mystery of what's holding it all in place.
Honestly, the best way to think about inflation right now is like a giant, heavily loaded seesaw. The overall rate didn't change because massive, violent price shifts in everyday sectors miraculously canceled each other out. Huge upward pressures slamming down on one end are being met with equal, heavy downward drags on the other. So instead of an economy at rest, what we actually have is an economy locked in a high-tension stalemate. Extreme volatility at the micro level is completely masked by stability at the macro level.
So, what does this all mean? Well, we need to figure out exactly who is on which side of this economic tug-of-war. On the upward-pushing side, literally fighting to drive inflation higher, we have transport and education, heaving with all their might. But pulling in the exact opposite direction, providing some massive downward relief to households, we have food, non-alcoholic beverages, and housing. And remember, these aren't niche markets. These specific categories completely dictate the reality of the average household budget. That's why their opposing momentum is so crucial to understand. Let's break down the heavy hitters.
Let's start with the upward side. Transport is violently lifting one end of our inflation seesaw. Transport inflation hit 6.8% in the 12 months leading up to May 2026. To put that into perspective, it was at 4.5% just a month prior. That is a massive acceleration in just 30 days. Actually, this marks the highest annual rate we've seen in the transport sector since December 2022. It's a huge, sudden surge that honestly threatened to blow the headline inflation rate wide open.
And what exactly is driving that transport spike? Well, a shocking 10.3% rise in airfares between April and May. But there's actually a fascinating calendar quirk hidden in this data. It all comes down to the timing of Easter. Because Easter fell in early April in 2026, tickets recorded during that period were unusually low for the standard collection window. That artificially lowered the April baseline, which made the subsequent standard pricing in May look like this massive, explosive hike. So a simple calendar quirk literally pushed up national inflation figures.
But hey, it's not just holiday flights, right? It's the daily commute that's really draining wallets. Average fuel prices hit 157.4 pence per liter in May.
We haven't seen this level of real-world pain at the petrol pump since those massive price spikes following the outbreak of the conflict in Ukraine back in late 2022. When you look at motor fuels overall, they rose by almost 25% in the last 12 months. That is a staggering logistical cost being absorbed by everyday drivers and supply chains alike.
Okay, so with flights and fuel exploding at double-digit rates, what on earth kept the headline inflation rate from just taking off? Well, the answer lies on the exact opposite side of the seesaw. Grocery inflation slowed dramatically, dropping down to a highly manageable 2.2%. That's the lowest it's been since December 2024. For lower and middle-income households, this drop is quite literally a lifeline. Your grocery bill essentially rushed in to save the day, perfectly neutralizing the transport chaos and preventing a broader economic spike.
If we take a walk down the supermarket aisles, the structural normalization of agricultural supply chains becomes super obvious. Everyday staples are cooling off rapidly. We're seeing powerful downward effects from meat, specifically things like beef and cooked ham, as well as essentials like cheese, fresh vegetables, and fish. The steadying of these agricultural outputs means that the price drops hitting your physical shopping basket were weighty enough to perfectly balance out the aggressive price hikes hitting you at the petrol pump. It's wild how perfectly that works out.
Now, to understand the other massive downward weight holding the economy steady, we have to talk about owner-occupiers housing, or OOH costs. Simply put, this is the ongoing cost of owning, maintaining, and living in your own home. It is a really big deal because it makes up roughly 18%, nearly a fifth, of the entire CPIH index. Because it encompasses the literal roof over our heads, it's what makes CPIH the most comprehensive and realistic measure of inflation that policymakers actually have at their disposal.
Applying that knowledge, we can see that housing and household services inflation dropped down to 2.7% in May. That represents the lowest rate the UK has experienced since June 2024. Specifically, those vital owner-occupiers housing costs we just talked about, they slowed down significantly to 3.3%. This easing in the broader housing sector acts like a massive, heavy anchor. It pulls the inflation seesaw firmly downwards, acting as the ultimate counterweight to those volatile spikes in transport and travel.
Looking over the last 23 months, housing's contribution to skyrocketing prices has been fading fast, reaching its smallest footprint in nearly 2 years. This is actually the delayed lag effect of interest rate stabilization and utility cap adjustments finally working their way through the system. Housing is undeniably still a major factor in the broader economy, for sure, but its role has completely shifted. It's transitioned from being the primary driver of inflation to becoming the primary shock absorber, keeping the national numbers grounded.
And oh man, buried within that housing data is a truly surprising fact regarding utilities. Get this, domestic heating oil prices actually crashed by an incredible 18.7% in May. No way, right? Because domestic heating oil isn't strictly capped the way electricity and gas are, it remains highly sensitive to global markets. So after spiking aggressively due to conflict in the Middle East, it has now plummeted right back down. That massive drop provided extreme downward pressure, fighting off those surging airfares and fuel costs in real time. So what happens when we strip away all this extreme volatility? We remove the swinging, uncapped energy prices, we take out the shifting food costs, we get what's called core CPIH. And what do we see? Another perfectly steady flat line, holding at 2.8%. That's the joint lowest since September 2021. But here's the thing, this flat line reveals an underlying stalemate. Goods inflation is actively slowing down to 2.0%, while services inflation is creeping up to a sticky 3.6%. They are just locked in a persistent, ongoing battle.
So, we are left with this incredibly delicate balance. The high costs of moving around the world are being entirely subsidized by the cooling costs of staying at home. But with global volatility showing absolutely zero signs of stopping, the big question is, which side of this economic seesaw will hit the ground first next month? Will the pain at the pump finally ease, or are we one supermarket price hike away from the whole thing just tipping over? Thanks for joining this explainer. Keep an eye on those numbers, guys, because a flat line like this, it simply won't last forever.